Thank you and good afternoon, and I'm really delighted to be part of this event today and to meet you all in the session and in the workshops later. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about children's rights and what we mean by a children's rights approach, but really importantly to think about the issue of violence against women and girls as a children's rights issue. And Joe's going to share my slides for me. Thank you, Joe. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So I wanted to start out with a very short introduction to human rights, and these might be something that many of you on the call today will be really very familiar with, but for others they may be something that you've heard about but not really sure what they mean. But at the very heart, essentially, human rights are all about the core things we as adults and for children and young people need in order to live a safe and happy and healthy life. We all have rights and they are universal. And at the foundation of all human rights treaties and charters is a recognition that inherent dignity and equal rights of people are the foundation to justice, peace and social progress. And human rights are not something that can be taken away from you by governments or by others, and they're not something that can be picked and chosen. And there are some scenarios where they can be limited. And one recent example that we've all lived through that was through the COVID restrictions brought in by governments around the world. And here the extent and time limited nature of those restrictions are very important things in terms of human rights. If we move on to the next slide, please. There are many different international human rights treaties which outline the rights that we have. We don't have time to cover them all today, but I wanted to highlight in the UK, the Human Rights Act 1998 is the key piece of legislation that sets out the fundamental rights and freedoms that everyone in the UK is entitled to, and it incorporates the rights set out in the European Convention of Human Rights into British domestic law. And it came into force in the UK in 2020. And on the screen there, you can see some of the rights that are protected under that piece of legislation. And really importantly, in terms of the context that we're speaking about today, the right not to be treated in an inhumane or degrading way, and the right to life being really fundamental here. And if we move on to the next slide, please. So for children and young people, they have additional rights, and these are set out in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is most widely ratified international human rights treaty in history. And the UNCRC is very unique and important for all children and young people under the age of 18 globally. It sets out 54 articles which cover all aspects of a child's life and explain how those in power must work together to make sure that all of the rights and all children and young people can enjoy these rights. I think the UNCRC is quite unique and unlike lots of other pieces of legislation that we come across, because it talks really about the importance for children in growing up in an environment of happiness, of love and understanding. And it recognises that children and young people are more vulnerable and therefore need special care and protection. But at the same time as doing that, it gives children and young people real status as rights holders and therefore moves them away from just being passive recipients of care, charity and protection to being agents in themselves and having a voice and say in their own lives and issues that affect them. We've already heard a lot from Councillor Buchanan around the extent of violence against women and girls and the need to recognise this as a breach of children's rights, and the impact that violence can have on them is often long-lasting and intergenerational. And we also heard how it's compounded by other breaches in rights, including poverty, lack of access to appropriate healthcare, and also for those with additional needs, that lack of access to special care for those with disabilities. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are 54 articles in the UNCRC and they're quite wide-ranging and varied in their nature, but I wanted to highlight a couple of those for you just now. So Article 12 being really important, and that is the right, an article that articulates that right to be listened to and taken seriously. Article 27 is around the right to a proper house, food and shelter. Article 19, the right to be protected from being hurt or treated badly. And Article 32, the right not to work until a certain age and to be protected from doing dangerous work. So it's really worth having and taking some time to look through the articles themselves and really taking time to digest and understand what's articulated in the UNCRC for children. If we move on to the next slide, please. So as I said, there's 54 articles in there, and I encourage you to, as I say, to go and have a look at what those are. But they can be largely grouped into 3 different categories, commonly called the 3 Ps. The first one is around provision, and these are the basic needs in terms of things like food, housing, transport, education. The second grouping is around protection, so freedom from abuse, protection from degrading punishment or arrest without proper judicial process. And finally, participation, and that right to express a view on all matters that affect them and to have those views taken seriously. So when we talk about taking a rights-based approach to our work, there are 4 general principles that are really core to how we apply these rights into our practice. And these should be thought about in terms of all of the approaches that we take to policy and practice, and really help us to embed dignity and to ensure a children's rights-based approach. And those are the right to life, survival and development, the importance of putting the best interests of the child to the fore in all decisions, the principle of non-discrimination, and really importantly, that right to voice in decisions that affect them. So when thinking about our response to children and young people experiencing gender-based violence, our response really cuts across all of those 3 Ps that we talked about. And during adolescence, violence against women and girls, we often see an overlap, with adolescent girls often experiencing violence that are commonly experienced by younger children, as well as violence more common in adulthood, such as in dating relationships or intimate partner violence or forced marriage. So a children's rights approach also requires us to consider that evolving capacity of the child and young person, and to tailor our response to those needs across those different age groups and ranges and experiences as well. Next slide, please. So aligning agendas was something that I really wanted to touch on in the context of today. And I know that many of you here today will be working in some really, really important policy areas that are listed here. So your focus might be specifically on adult protection, child protection, or in trauma-informed practice. You might be leading on the promise at local level, or you might be working directly with children in a community setting. And at times it can feel like there are lots of policy narratives out there, and trying to align these in your everyday work can feel really, really challenging. And I spoke to a practitioner last week who was trying to really help a family in crisis. And she said that she felt like her head was just going to explode with all of the different policy narratives that she was trying to make sure she applied, when really she was really just trying to focus on the family in front of her and what their needs were. I think in scenarios like this, it's really important to take a pause and to look at how all of these national priorities are really deeply interlinked and should be considered together as part of that broader ambition to improve the outcomes for children and young people and individuals and broader communities in Scotland. They all have a focus on tackling inequality, adversity and trauma in all of their forms. And really, a child's rights approach, a gendered approach, and a trauma-informed approach all provide vital and complementary ways and expertise to understand the gaps, the challenges, the strengths in our current systems, and to really think through what is required to improve outcomes for those different population groups that you're working with, and to think through the response that are required. So instead of thinking through that they're all separate, really thinking about what's underpinning them all. And for rights to be real in practice, they have to be seen and felt in real life scenarios and in places and spaces in which we work in our day-to-day practice. And that's what makes them really real in practice, and we need to hold on to that. Next slide, please. So this slide is really just highlighting some of the commonality between the different narratives that are out there. And here I've just highlighted the preamble, which I've mentioned already, from the UNCRC around that to grow up in an environment of happiness, love and understanding. And across the promise and the GERFIC agenda and Equally Safe, we can see all of those that desire kind of replicated, and the word safety and respect and loved coming through those agendas in terms of how we apply them as well. So I thought it was useful to see that commonality in those words. Next slide, please. So a key focus of the 16 Days campaign this year is to ask kind of what's next. And in Scotland, we're on the brink of incorporating the UNCRC into Scots law. And the UNCRC Scotland bill aims to fully and directly incorporate the UNCRC into Scots law. And importantly, this will give children and young people recourse to the law for breaches in their rights, and also place a proactive duty on public bodies to act in a manner that is compatible with the UNCRC, so with those articles that we talked about earlier. And really importantly for public bodies, they will need to report every 3 years on what they have done and what they plan to do to uphold children's rights. For children and young people themselves, the implementation programme and the duties on public bodies will allow them the opportunity to grow up and learning about their rights and being empowered to claim them. So together, this brings a huge potential to develop a culture of everyday accountability for rights in Scotland, described by many as a revolution in children's rights. Next slide, please. So to get ready for incorporation, local authorities will need to take a range of proactive steps and approaches to work out how they will be compliant and prepared for the new duties that will bring them. This includes work around leadership, commitment and explicit corporate commitment to children's rights, but also really important work to ensure that they understand rights themselves, that they can identify where rights are being breached, to check if their complaints and feedback processes are child-friendly, and to challenge themselves to respond in a manner which uses the maximum resources available to progress children's rights. But they'll also need to develop ways in which they listen to children and young people and involve them in decisions that affect them. What is important in this space is to ensure that violence against women and girls is identified and considered as a children's rights issue, and the response to children and young people affected by gender-based violence is dealt with, and policy and practice is developed in a children's rights way. Next slide, please. So in the improvement service, we have a new project that is around supporting local authorities to get ready for incorporation, and we've got a range of work and support available to local authorities. And events like today are a really important part of that work as we champion the children's rights approach and talk to a range of colleagues from different sectors and policy areas to think about children's rights and what local authorities need to do. One of the key messages out there is that children's rights don't solely apply just to education settings or just to children's services. They apply across the piece in terms of the public services that are available. Transport, housing, environmental policy, it's all relevant to children's rights. And many of the skills that you may have in terms of the work that you're already doing can help colleagues in other settings to apply a children's rights-based approach. Next slide, please. These are just a set of challenge questions that I included in here for when you kind of maybe come back to think about the day that you've had, and maybe some questions that you can share with colleagues as well. So I won't dwell on them for too long. And very finally, on my final slide, I have included my contact details and my contact details for my colleague Felicia, and you can get in touch with us if you're looking for any advice and support on children's rights. And we also have a Knowledge Hub group for anybody working in children's rights practice in Scotland that you're very welcome to join. So I'll pass you back to Samantha now and look forward to speaking with you in the breakout groups later. Thank you.